Saudi ulama felt that it was not really possible to support the Iranian revolution because it's not really considered an Islamic revolution. But Ayatollah Khomeini also challenged the ruling families in the region. He called the Saudi ruling family as corrupt, but I think Rashid Rida also changed towards the end of his life. I think he became more and more conservative towards the end of his life. And I think he was so disillusioned with the end of the caliphate, the abolition of the caliphate in 1924. And he was part of this movement to revive the caliphate. And he saw Abdulaziz ibn Saud as a brilliant candidate for it. And that's why he tried to rehabilitate Wahhabism and engage with the Najdi ulama. Al-Asala, for example, sided with the Muslim Brotherhood, but Hizb al-Nur decided to side with the military. So again, the Salafis, not only that they reassess their position and where they, how they define their relations with the state during the Egyptian uprising, but afterwards they also continue to reassess their situation and whether or not we should participate in elections, whether or not we should support the Muslim Brotherhood, what's really important for us, and so on.
Assalamu alaikum and welcome back to another episode of the Markfield Institute podcast. Today we have a very special guest with us. We have Professor Raihan Ismail from the University of Oxford. Professor Raihan is the current winner of the 2024 Muslim World Book Award for her recent outstanding publication entitled Rethinking Salafism, the Transnational Network of Salafi Ulama in Egypt, Kuwait and Saudi Arabia. Her research interests include political Islam, Sunni-Shia relations, and the intertwining nature of religion and politics in Muslim societies. We're also joined by Dr. Ridwan Karim from the Markfield Institute, and I'm your host, Dr. Harun Bashir. Very pleased to have you with us today, Professor Raihan. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. And thank you for having me.
Okay, Professor Raihan, let's get straight into it. So the book is about Salafism. Quite simply, what is Salafism?
It's a very good question. So Salafism, or Salafi, derives from as-Salaf as-Salih, which means the followers of pious ancestors. And the Salafi tradition advocates for Muslims to follow the footsteps of the pious ancestors. And when we talk about the pious ancestors, we're referring to the first 3 generations of Muslims. And when we think about Salafism, of course, it's very diverse as well in terms of its theology, its jurisprudence. But one could argue that the Salafis advocate for absolute monotheism, which means that you have to promote Tawheed. And by Tawheed, it means that you do not associate God with other beings. So Tawheed is seen as very important within the Salafi tradition. What's also important is respecting a hadith, and the Salafis in particular promote the preservation of authentic hadith. And I think we know some Salafi figures who actually advocated for the preservation of authentic hadith. So in a nutshell, Salafism is about promoting monotheism. It's about following the footsteps of pious ancestors, the rulings of the pious ancestors, and making sure that you do not deviate from the footsteps or the traditions established by the pious ancestors.
So that's the kind of core belief system that makes one a Salafi, let's say. Are there different instantiations, manifestations of Salafism? Is it a monolith, or are there kind of different trends within Salafi thinking?
Again, it's a very good question, because the Salafi trend is also quite diverse. It's not really a monolith. You have various trends within the Salafi tradition, and scholars have actually written on the subject. In a famous article in 2006 published by Horowitz, he talked about the different trends within the Salafi tradition, but he takes a political approach when trying to understand the Salafi tradition. So clearly, some would argue that within the Salafi tradition, you have different approaches to executing your faith. One that takes a political position, One trend, we're looking at Salafis who advocate political quietism. So that's one trend within the Salafi tradition. Another trend within the Salafi tradition that is often talked about is the activist tradition. So, of course, you have different names for the activist tradition. Some call them harakis, some call them activists. And you have a third trend, which is the jihadi trend, which means that those who believe that you have to establish an Islamic state, but more importantly, you have to challenge existing political order. And for you to challenge existing political order is for you to overthrow existing political order. And violence is acceptable. So we know that groups such as Al-Qaeda, groups such as ISIS advocate they believe in Salafism, but they advocate the jihadi Salafi approach to establishing an acceptable Islamic order. The first two trends are non-violent. They do not advocate violence at all in their approach. The first trend would say just accept the state, the status quo. If you want to challenge the ruler, you have to do it discreetly. You cannot embarrass the ruler. You have to advise the ruler. Even if the ruler violates Sharia, you still have to kind of advise the ruler discreetly as not to embarrass the ruler. But the activist trend believe that it's important to challenge existing political order, but you have to do it within the established framework, the acceptable frameworks. Including elections, participating in elections, including grassroots movements and so on. But clearly, you have these various trends within the Salafi tradition.
It's interesting because I think when we're defining Salafism, you're talking about in terms of political lines. But I think you had mentioned there are other lines that you could define Salafism. What other examples are there of defining Salafism not through political lines, which is probably the most popular way that it's defined, but what other lines could be used to define Salafism?
Even within the Salafi tradition, and I know scholars have actually talked about this and discussed this extensively. When we try to categorize Salafis and Salafi believers, Salafi clerics, it's helpful, especially if we want to understand where they stand politically. But when you zoom in and try and understand Salafism, it's actually more complex, it's actually more vibrant. And these categorizations can help to understand Salafism, but it doesn't really explain Salafism. It doesn't really explain how Salafi actors, Salafi clerics, Salafi believers behave. What do they think about their activities? How do they engage with the state? How do they engage with their communities? And I think that complexity hasn't been captured, I think, in the academic literature. Scholars have written on the subject, but I think there's still a lot more to explore. To answer your question on the Salafis in particular, and looking at the Salafis outside, this perception, or how do I say this? Looking at Salafis as political actors alone, there are so many issues that would divide Salafis, not necessarily politically. So you can't tell a Salafi cleric who believes that you have to support the state, you have to demonstrate loyalty to the state in order to avoid dissension and so on, because that's part of the quietist tradition, that he is similar to other quietists when it comes to social issues. He is similar to quietists, fellow quietists when it comes to, how whether we should engage with non-Muslims, whether we should allow women to drive, whether we should allow women to run as candidates in elections. So you have that diversity even within the quietist trend, and that's why it doesn't really work when we talk about these categorizations. When it comes to other issues, it's more dynamic. It's definitely more nuanced as well.
You demonstrated the kind of dynamism and different trends of thinking in your first book, Saudi Clerics and Shia Islam. And in that book, you look at the different ways in which specifically Salafi scholars from Saudi engage with Shia Islam. Could you perhaps just speak to the range of views that you covered, and maybe more specifically why you chose to focus on Saudi clerics?
Of course. There's so many ways to answer that question. And I believe as an academic, I always look back and try and criticize my own work. And sometimes I'm like, oh, maybe I should have approached it differently. And I think I will continue to do that. I'm working on a different project at the moment. And I know that, once I've completed this project, I will go back and say, no, well, I didn't like that approach. So for me, it's how we always try to understand. And going back to your question, why did I decide to work on Salafi ulama in Saudi Arabia, or the Saudi clerics in my first book? I thought that when it comes to Saudi Arabia, maybe I can share a personal story, if that's all right.
Sure.
So my father's, Malaysian, who studied in Egypt. When I was born in Egypt, he came back to Malaysia. My father moved to Malaysia. The whole family moved back to Malaysia, and my father was a school teacher. So he taught Sharia. And in the 80s, part of his job is to attend training and workshops. And one time he left our house, my state, and went to a different state. It's just Kelantan. So they had a workshop in Kelantan, which is in northern Malaysia. And this was in the 80s. And he went there. When he came back, I remember him having this conversation with my mother. I was in primary school then. And he said that I didn't know, when it comes to the Islamic Revolution of 1979, it was not really an Islamic revolution. When we're thinking about Ayatollah Khomeini, he was not really a Muslim. So that's what my father said. And that workshop was actually organized by Saudi ulama from Saudi Arabia, who went all the way to Malaysia to organize this training. And as a child, I was like, oh, that's really interesting. I had no idea what he was talking about, but I remembered that. And when I was older, I had this conversation with him. Clearly, you're looking at the influence of Saudi ulama or Saudi teachers. I wouldn't assume they were ulama. I mean, I think, they're probably trainers who had experience in Islamic studies and so on. So that's why I wanted to know more about Shi'ism. And in 2006, of course, we have the sectarian war in Iraq. And clearly people were talking about the sectarian war. Then you had Hezbollah against Israel in 2006 as well. It was because some of the Saudi ulama actually came out and said, you're not allowed to support Hezbollah because it's not really an Islamic movement. And that's what triggered my interest. And I thought, okay, if I want to study Shi'ism or Sunni Shia relations, I wanted to look at the Saudi ulama in particular to understand their positions theologically, politically, and jurisprudentially as well. Some of these critical issues that they have highlighted when it comes to understanding Sunni Shia relations. So that actually triggered. So it's a long story. I don't know whether you're going to include it, but
Sure.
yeah, but that's what motivated me.
And on that point, then, in the book, I mean, you look at the differing views. What are the kind of range of views? I mean, you mentioned for some people, for example, Khomeini is not even a Muslim because Shias are not considered Muslims. And are some of the Salafi scholars more accommodating towards Shia Islam?
I think it has changed a lot. So when we think or talk about these Salafi ulama, I would say, in 1979, when the Iranian Revolution happened, Salafi ulama refused to support the Iranian Revolution. And I would argue it was a matter of geopolitics, but also it was a theological issue. And we go back to defining Salafism, it's all about absolute monotheism within the Salafi tradition. And when we talk about absolute monotheism, shrine visitations would not be considered Islamic. It would be considered bid'ah. And bid'ah, which means innovations, particularly religious innovations. Religious innovation is not acceptable within the Salafi tradition. So if you visit Imam Ali's shrine, or if you visit Karbala, Imam Hussein's shrine, so these practices would be considered as removed or amount to infidelity. And because of that, I think there's when we look at theological reasons, clearly Saudi ulama felt that it was not really possible to support the Iranian revolution because it's not really considered an Islamic revolution. But Ayatollah Khomeini also challenged the ruling families in the region. He called the Saudi ruling family as corrupt. He also incited Shiite populations in the region to revolt against their rulers. And there was also this political threat that the Iranian Revolution presented.
We have the siege of Mecca.
The siege of Mecca. But the siege of Mecca was, I would say, it's really interesting because Juhayman al-Utaybi, he was a true hardcore, if I can use the word hardcore Salafi. And for him, it was more about preserving the authenticity of Saudi Arabia as a state that promotes Salafi ideals. And Juhayman al-Utaybi's vision was to remove corrupt practices. He felt the Saudi ruling family was not even Islamic enough. And he felt that Saudi Arabia was changing too much. So you had female mannequins, you had cinemas in Jeddah. And Juhayman al-Utaybi decided that you've got to change that because the Saudi ruling family is not really committed to Islamization and they are modernizing, and therefore it's really problematic. But the same year,
So I think that's what I was kind of hinting towards, in the fact that on one side you've the pressure that the Saudi ruling family may have felt at that point is perhaps on one side you've got the quote-unquote Islamic revolution taking place in 1979, and he's being critiqued by someone like Khomeini as being un-Islamic, and then you have people within your society equally parroting very similar types of arguments.
No, absolutely. And I think in many ways that changed Saudi Arabia. And this is where Mohammed bin Salman, when he talks about modernizing and reforming Saudi Arabia, he's actually referring to this period. The reason he's referring to this period, he was saying that before 1979, we were modernizing. Saudi Arabia was a little bit different. Jeddah was a little bit different. But why is it after 1979 in particular, the Saudi state has changed so much? And I think that this period in particular is quite important. Some would argue, and I think I've seen some scholars have put a similar argument. 1979, the Saudi ruling family was criticized by Ayatollah Khomeini. The same year, Juhayman al-Utaybi's siege happened. And to reinforce their religious credibility, they promoted conservatism and re-empowered the Saudi religious establishment. So I think for some Saudis, things changed so much after 1979 because King Khalid came to power and realized that we have to reinforce our religious credentials. At least that's one interpretation. But clearly, when it comes to relations with the Saudis, with Iran, Saudi ulama also embarked on publications of books by some of the ulama criticizing the Iranian Revolution, looking at Shia theology. There are misconceptions, I would say, on so many levels, but there also engagement with Shia theology, with Shia jurisprudence. So here we're looking at intensity and frequency of anti-Shia publications, anti-Shia fatwa propagated and put forward by the Saudi ulama. And it's quite different from other ulama of different traditions. So Al-Azhar takes a different approach. You have other scholars in other parts of the Muslim who take a different approach as well. But I would say that when it comes to the Salafi tradition, clearly there's a little bit of hostility for theological reasons, but also jurisprudential reasons. But what's interesting, as I've mentioned earlier as well, it's the changes that took place within the Salafi tradition. And here, what I've tried to argue in the first book is that these ulama are also influenced by what's happening within their country, particularly within Saudi Arabia. Some of them have also engaged with Shia ulama. Some of them have also reassessed their positions. So one famous alim is Adil al-Kalbani, a Saudi alim, who declared and in a vocal television interview saying that Shia ulama are kuffar. They're removed from Islam. But if you revisit Adil al-Kalbani, he actually apologized for that statement much later, saying that he made a mistake. That was unnecessary. But here we're looking at the Salafis engaging with what's happening in the region. So 2006, 2007, the sectarian civil war in Iraq. So you have Salafi ulama issuing, sermons, delivering lectures, talking about what's happening in Iraq. So the perception is that Iraqi Sunnis were being marginalized in Iraq and were being targeted by Shias in Iraq, being targeted by Iran, being targeted by Shia militias and so on. And as a result, the ulama, use theology to justify their political positions as well. So you see a lot of that that happened in 2006. Syrian civil war, that was another example of how the Salafi ulama in particular felt that here you have Hezbollah, you have Iran supporting Bashar al-Assad, despite the fact that Bashar al-Assad is actually an Alawite, which is, a little bit different from the Ithna Asharis. But again, or the 12 Shi'ism. But at the same time, here you do have the ulama engaging with the political situation in the region.
So what you've spoken about there, you speak about how the politics of the region can impact theological views sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
Are there instances? So for example, how did because I think you've mentioned previously, you speak about in the book, the Gulf War in the Shia community in Saudi were almost supportive of it. Did that, if I'm not misquoting you, how did that impact the conversations regarding Shi'ism among Salafi circles?
Yeah. So in the book, I argue that the Salafis, they have their own theological positions, but I think sometimes they don't discuss Shi'ism all the time. So what I mean is that it depends on the situation in the region. It depends on what's happening, but they don't really change their theological position or their attitudes towards the Shia. And I think that's very much the case with members of the religious establishment. But they talk about the Shia or continue to issue publications when something's happening, and the frequency and intensity of the publications or the fatwa they issue depends on the situation in the region. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Sure.
So, sorry, I said it better in the lecture.
No, it's fine.
So the reason is that it depends, so how they view the Shia remains the same, but how they behave towards the Shia would depend on their political circumstances. And when it comes to the Gulf War, for example, the state initially had terrible relations with the Shia, if I want to put it, so crudely. So 1979, there was a revolt in the eastern province of Saudi Arabia. The Shia were influenced by what was happening in Iran. And the Saudi state clearly targeted the Shia community in the eastern province. And as a result, relations between the state and the Shia in the eastern province deteriorated. But that changed following Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait. When Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, the Shia in Saudi Arabia were actually approached by Saddam Hussein because he realized that the Shia dislike the ruling family. And he thought, maybe I will get the support from the Shia community in Saudi Arabia. And the Shia community in Saudi Arabia refused to support Saddam Hussein. And they demonstrated loyalty to the state. And as a result, the state then, the relations with the Shia community in Saudi Arabia improved drastically as well. So the state pardoned, Shia political prisoners. They allowed those in exile to return, restored their passports and so on. and engaged in negotiations, engaged in interfaith dialogue or initiated interfaith dialogue between Shia communities and the Salafi ulama in Saudi Arabia. So one example is the Grand Mufti of Saudi Arabia. So the Grand Mufti of Saudi Arabia, Sheikh Ibn Baz, initially refused to shake hands with Shia believers, because for him it's like, no, I'm not going to even shake hands with Shia believers. But he participated in some of these negotiations, but also meetings with Shia leaders and Shia ulama in Saudi Arabia. So the point is that, yes, maybe they don't really, or in the case of Sheikh Ibn Baz, he did not really demonstrate theological shift in how he engaged with Shia believers, but for political reasons, perhaps, he was able, or he was willing to have conversations with Shia believers in Saudi Arabia, and that's because of the state. And it goes back to the idea that some Salafis who believe in loyalty to the state would do what the state would like them to do.
Great. Let's move on to the next book. So the first book, and from there you have the second book, and I believe it's kind of a continuation or a broadening. A key kind of terminology, I suppose, we should define is transnational, because this is the word used. So how do you use that term? What do you mean by that? And what are you referring to?
Of course. So I'm looking at transnational networks of Salafi ulama in the second book. And what I mean by the networks or transnational networks of Salafi ulama is how Salafi ulama engage with each other, despite the fact that they're not from the same country. So transnational activities of Salafi ulama, where they travel to, let's say, Saudi Arabia, where they engage with Saudi ulama. If, let's say, they're from Egypt, they engage with Saudi ulama in Egypt. They travel for educational purposes. They travel for pilgrimage. They travel for other reasons, including attending conferences and organizing conferences that are transnational in nature. In the book as well, when I'm talking about these transnational networks, I'm also looking at how they engage with each other in terms of publications. Some Saudi ulama would publish in an Egyptian magazine despite the fact that they're from Kuwait, or despite the fact that they are Salafi ulama from Saudi Arabia. The same with Kuwaiti magazines as well. So there's one Kuwaiti magazine called Al-Furqan. So Saudi ulama as well as Egyptian ulama have been featured and have also published in some of these magazines and periodicals. So I'm looking at these activities that are transnational in nature. And in the book, I look at how the ulama come together to promote this, I think, Salafi identity almost, and how they try to shape Salafi identity, not just within their own countries, but also how they do it transnationally.
And what were some of the trends that you found in the relationship between these transnational networks?
Yeah, again, so these networks are vibrant, I would say, and they're not new. They emerged perhaps during, Rashid Rida's time. I would say I would trace it back to Rashid Rida's time, when Rashid Rida engaged with the Saudi ruler Abdulaziz ibn Saud, and how he actually, one of the things that he wanted to do was to promote Abdulaziz ibn Saud as, the leader of the Muslim world, because he was very fond of Abdulaziz ibn Saud. And I think because of that, he also fostered relations with Najdi ulama. They were all Wahhabi ulama who were very supportive of Abdulaziz ibn Saud. And he engaged with them, he negotiated with them, he discussed issues with them. And Saudi ulama, as well as Egyptian ulama, came together as part of this transnational network. And they've also traveled, Egyptian ulama would travel to Saudi Arabia, and Saudi ulama would also come to Egypt. So I'm looking and tracing these movements as well when it comes to how the Saudi ulama and the Egyptian ulama engage with each other during this time.
It's really interesting that you mentioned Rashid Rida. Could you talk a little bit about the genealogy of Salafism? How far back can we go? And
of course.
What is that genealogy?
Yeah. It's really hard because there's so many, trends as well. Historically, how Salafism developed, and how do we understand the development of Salafism. So some would argue that if you want to look at Salafism, you go back all the way back to the Ahl al-Hadith movement. The Ahl al-Hadith movement propagated by Ibn Hanbal, and how he rejected Mu'tazilite tradition, how he rejected, he didn't reject the Ash'ari, but rejected the Mu'tazili tradition. And that's, you can kind of basically trace the development of Salafism, the Ahl al-Hadith. But others would say that perhaps it wasn't Ibn Hanbal. Yes, maybe it was, but Ibn Taymiyyah was the one who actually, kind of pioneered the Salafi tradition. And Ibn Taymiyyah talked about following the footsteps of, the pious ancestors. Ibn Taymiyyah was also emphasizing the importance of Tawheed. Ibn Taymiyyah was also very critical of deviations, people who have deviated from the correct and the, authentic understanding of Islam. He was very prolific. He's written on the Sufis, he's written on the Shia. And some would argue that perhaps Ibn Taymiyyah was, kind of the start of the Salafi movement. Fast forward, others would say, maybe Ibn Abdul Wahhab, Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, the founder, the eponymous founder of the Wahhabi school of thought. Wahhabism is seen as a derogatory identification of Salafism. But one could argue that Ibn Abdul Wahhab was the one who actually, talked about a Salaf al-Salih. What I'm trying to demonstrate is that there are just so many figures that perhaps played a role in trying to define and refine Salafism. Others would go to Muhammad Abdu and Jamaluddin al-Afghani.
Be very different from...
Very different.
But still defined as Salafism.
Defined as Salafism. So some scholars have written on Abdu and Afghani, and I was actually very interested because I thought that Abdu and al-Afghani identified as Salafis. But apparently, according to one of the scholars, Henry Lozier, I think, he argued in his book that if you look at Jamaluddin al-Afghani and Muhammad Abdu's, publications, they've never really identified as Salafis. Yes, they talked about following the footsteps of the pious ancestors. They also advocated for the return to authentic or divine sources. So, of course, forget the madhahib. We want to go back to the Quran and ahadith, and that's how we're going to ensure that we're no longer backwards and so on. So that was the rhetoric of Jamaluddin al-Afghani and Muhammad Abdu. But if you look at what they've said, they haven't really talked about themselves as being Salafis. But others attributed Salafism to Muhammad Abdu and al-Afghani. So how do we understand this really confusing trends within Salafism historically? Some scholars call them enlightened Salafis, and they're very different. They no longer exist as Salafis. So today people call them progressive, moderates, whatever you want to name them. Modernists, I think modernist is the term that people ascribe to Muhammad Abdu and Jamaluddin al-Afghani. But Salafism, when we understand Salafism or try to understand Salafism today, I think Abdu and al-Afghani can have been removed from that equation, despite the fact that, many people felt that they were Salafis themselves. But in terms of Muhammad Abdu, he was so critical of the Wahhabis. He was not fond of the Wahhabis at all. And this is where it's really interesting. I think, we were looking at that point, how for Muhammad Abdu, the Wahhabis were regressive. And despite the fact that, we think about, the Wahhabis and Muhammad Abdu as Salafis, they're very different in terms of, what they believed in.
I was just going to make the point there. The difference perhaps is best accentuated when we look at the difference between Abdu and Rida. Even though Rida is Abdu's student, arguably is far more conservative than Abdu. But it just, perhaps it also highlights the kind of, if we can use this word, the diversity of thought within Salafism, if that term can be kind of extended to include someone like Abdu, who is working with the British at one point and is seen as a kind of liberal reformer, very pro-science, tries to reform Azhar, etc., all the way to as you mentioned, Najdi Ulama, and again, it kind of speaks to how flexible perhaps that term can be used. Or the flexible manner in which that term can be used. But I think for a lot of people, it would be absolutely shocking to, when you mentioned it earlier, I was quite struck that you had, for example, not in a derogatory sense, but a Wahhabi ulama publishing in Al-Manar, which is seen as this kind of vehicle for liberal reform, and as many people have kind of referred to Abdu as a liberal reformer, right?
No, of course, absolutely. And I think when I was doing research, I was equally surprised because I was like, what? Rashid Rida, that's not the impression that you have of Rashid Rida. But I think Rashid Rida also changed towards the end of his life. I think he became more and more conservative towards the end of his life. And I think he was so disillusioned with the end of the caliphate, the abolition of the caliphate in 1924. And he was part of this movement to revive the caliphate. And he saw Abdulaziz ibn Saud as a brilliant candidate for it. And that's why he tried to rehabilitate Wahhabism and engage with the Najdi ulama. And I think he was very fond of Abdulaziz ibn Saud. If I'm not mistaken, in one of his publications, he talked about Abdulaziz ibn Saud as another figure very similar to Umar II. And he felt that Umar II was a great leader, was a great caliph, and therefore he felt that Abdulaziz ibn Saud should, should lead the Muslim community. And I think this is where, as you've mentioned earlier, Al-Manar became an avenue for the Najdi ulama to circulate their publications. The Najdi ulama initially used the term Al-Wahhabiyya, so that was not really seen as derogatory, although some felt it was kind of derogatory because they said we're Ahl al-Tawheed, we're people of monotheism, Ahl al-Tawheed, and we are believers and so on. And Wahhabism became quite derogatory because it's like, why are you calling us Wahhabis? We're not followers of Ibn Abdul Wahhab, we're followers of the pious ancestors. So this is really derogatory. And Rashid Rida was the one who actually bestowed the term Salafis upon the Wahhabis. And in his publications, he was like, Al-Wahhabiyya aw As-Salafiyya. So he tried to really rehabilitate Wahhabis and call them Salafis. And in the 1970s in particular, the Wahhabis changed their publications and used the term Salafis more extensively. So I think from the 1970s onwards, so if you look at books published by the Saudi religious establishment, they changed how they describe themselves, or the titles of their books and so on, and started using the term Salafis. But I would argue that Rashid Rida played an instrumental role in ascribing Salafism to the Wahhabis.
So I want to move on to some significant events that have happened in the Middle East, in the Islamic world. Key among them is the Arab Spring. How much of a factor did the Arab Spring play in what was happening in some of these conversations when we're talking about Salafism?
Of course, really played a significant role in forcing the ulama to reassess their positions when it comes to their relations with the state. So some of the Salafi ulama, again, it depends on where they're located. So the second book, in particular, looked at the networks of these ulama, and I looked at the ulama who are based in Egypt, Kuwait, and Saudi Arabia. And as I've mentioned in the lecture as well, so the ulama in Egypt, because of their local circumstances, they've always practiced political quietism. The Muslim Brotherhood occupied the political space. Salafis felt more comfortable, being silent about politics or not talk about politics very much. They focus on promoting social conservatism. They were talking about the niqab. They discuss the beard and whether or not men should, keep their beard. So again, these were some of the things that these ulama talked about. And they focused on Sufism. They were critical of Al-Azhar at times, but at the same time, they did not really, refuse to criticize the state.
Sorry, just on that point, you mentioned that's a kind of long-standing position within the Egyptian setting, going all the way back to Nasser, you mentioned.
Yeah, absolutely. Going all the way back to Nasser. And I think the reason, but of course, within the Salafi Salafi movement in Egypt, there will always be breakaway groups. So, one or two, how do I say, I'm trying to remember the book. So what I've actually written in the book. So basically, there are some Salafis who, would flirt with the Muslim Brotherhood, for instance, who would also kind of challenge the state, but they were in the minority. But the overwhelming majority of Salafis in Egypt practice political quietism. Ansar Sunnah al-Muhammadiyya, for example, the Egyptian Salafi Association, really refused to criticize the state. I think at least they didn't want to talk about politics until the Egyptian revolution happened. So some of them, I was going to answer your point. I can't remember. Oh dear.
I think no, I just made the point that it was this policy is kind of their quietism has extended all the way back to Nasser. Even when you've got kind of a secular leftist in charge in Egypt, there's a tendency of, okay, we're not going to push back against this.
Absolutely.
Whereas interestingly, as you mentioned, in Saudi, you've got a completely different approach to, we're going to clamp down on any kind of Nasserism that's trying to enter our domain here.
Yeah, no, of course. Thank you for reminding me, because one thing that's interesting about Ansar Sunnah al-Muhammadiyya, when Gamal Abdel Nasser, there was an attempted assassination on Gamal Abdel Nasser, Ansar Sunnah al-Muhammadiyya wrote or published an article supporting Gamal Abdel Nasser, or a statement supporting Gamal Abdel Nasser. And they even visited Gamal Abdel Nasser. And they were very critical of the Muslim Brotherhood. So they clashed with the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. So you can see a tradition of supporting the ruler and endorsing the ruler, regardless of the ruler's political position. And this kind of changed because of the Egyptian uprising, because the Egyptian uprising provided an avenue for the ulama to reassess their position. Maybe they were supportive of the state for self-preservation. Maybe they were supportive of the state because they genuinely believe that it's important to support the state. Theologically, you have ulama who would promote, loyalty to the ruler. And I think that's part of the jurisprudential position. That's also part of how they've interpreted and defined Salafism. But there are also those who felt that this is an opportunity to challenge or to come to power, to change Egypt. Remember, after the Egyptian uprising, it was just so confusing, chaotic. It was really messy. So there were opportunities for Salafis to actually change and reassess their position.
I mean, how something like the Arab Spring can allow scholars, or in this particular context, Salafi scholars, to rethink about what that relationship is with the state. Almost, it's a political factor that influences the trajectory of what. And I do wonder, like, has there been a shift in that trajectory? Because then obviously you had the Muslim Brotherhood in charge, and then after the Muslim Brotherhood, the relationship with the Salafis in Egypt with the government, I believe that was quite strengthened after the Muslim Brotherhood. So
tagging on to that, what was the response when Morsi was kind of taken? I don't know if taken out, the coup took place, let's say, against Morsi. Were the Salafis, ulama, supportive of that? Did they see that? Did they speak out against it?
Yes, some were supportive of the state, of the military.
Okay.
While others refused to endorse the military. They sided with the Muslim Brotherhood. Al-Asala, for example, sided with the Muslim Brotherhood, but Hizb al-Nur decided to side with the military. So again, the Salafis, not only that they reassess their position and where they, what they how they defined their relations with the state during the Egyptian uprising. But afterwards, they also continue to reassess their situation and whether or not we should participate in elections, whether or not we should support the Muslim Brotherhood, what's really important for us, and so on. So I feel that despite the fact that the Salafis in Egypt decided that they, it was really fragmented in terms of the position of the Salafis in Egypt.
I mean, I think that fragmentation perhaps goes all the way back to the earlier conversation we were having, because you mentioned the progenitor of Salafism for some would be someone like Rashid Rida. And of course, for others, Abdu Rida Afghani give birth to Pan-Islamism, right? And, I think it's Esposito that says you can draw a clear line between Abdu and Rida and Hassan al-Banna and the birth of Ikhwan. So it's interesting that Rashid Rida, on one side, you've got Salafism, which may or may not be quietist. On the other side, you've got kind of Ikhwan and the Muslim Brotherhood, which also links back to those same ideas. So I guess what I'm saying is that because you can see the genealogy of those ideas, it's interesting to see that even amongst the Salafis, you've got those that perhaps are slightly closer to the Ikhwani position and those that are, more towards the kind of state, no matter what.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, I think that's a very good point, because when it comes to the Salafis, particularly after the first Gulf War, some Salafis decided that they were not going to accept this idea where you have to be loyal to the state and support the state regardless of their actions. And the Salafis, some of them decided to challenge the state by petitioning against the state, particularly Saudi Arabia, for allowing US troops to be based on Saudi soil. That sparked that activist trend within the Salafi tradition. And many of them were also very fond of the Muslim Brotherhood. They felt very close to Muslim Brotherhood style activism. And some of the scholars actually looked at these Salafis as a hybrid movement where theologically they're Salafis, but when it comes to their activism, they're very similar to the Muslim Brotherhood. So Sheikh Salman al-Auda, for example, when you listen to his sermons and lectures and read his work or ask him questions about Salafi theology, he's very close to the Salafi religious tradition. In terms of jurisprudence, very close to the Hanbali school of thought. But when it comes to activism, you can see there's a lot of support and sympathy for the Ikhwan, the Muslim Brotherhood, a lot of sympathy for activism, for revolutionaries, for political reforms in Muslim societies. So clearly, some Salafis, particularly the activist Salafis, have a lot of similarities with the Muslim Brotherhood in that sense.
Thank you. The last question I think we'll try and wrap up with is looking at Salafism in the modern period. A lot of changes happening in Saudi Arabia, for example. How has that affected Salafism as a group, as when we talk about Salafi ulama?
Yeah, I think, again, this is really, for me, when we think about movements, they respond to challenges. And that's why these movements, or Islamist movements, or any other movements, they're never static. They always, and they continue to reassess their, political position, even when it comes to religious positions. And I would say that even within Salafism, some Salafi ulama have also reassessed Salafi religious tradition. One of them is Sheikh Hatim al-Auni. Some argue that he's a leader of a post-Salafi movement. Others would say he's still within the Salafi tradition. Others would say probably not, because Salafis have kind of rejected him. Not all Salafis have rejected it, but some Salafis said that, no, it's ridiculous. He's really quite far removed from our tradition. But here you have someone who advocates Salafi ideals, but decides to question existing Salafi traditions. In fact, he argued that we have to change the way we look at Salafism. And we can't rely on the works of Ibn Abdul Wahhab. We can't rely on the works of the Najdi ulama because, yes, they've made mistakes as well. So they're not really infallible. And therefore, he's reassessing Salafi jurisprudence when it comes to, whether or not we should be allowed to listen to music, whether or not we should be allowed to engage with non-Muslims. So you have different positions taken by Salafi ulama as well, because they are forced to reassess their positions. And I think sometimes the role of the state is also important. And in the context of Saudi Arabia, for example, the Salafi or the Saudi religious establishment has altered their position when it comes to allowing women to drive. They're saying that we never really had an issue with allowing women to drive. Before, we felt that it's important for women not to be allowed to drive to ensure their safety. But now I think the state has decided that women should be allowed to drive. We've never really had a religious position on the matter. We had a social position on the matter. So they're trying to recalibrate as well, because they feel it's important for them to ensure that they're supportive of what the state wants to do.
This isn't obviously the first, as you mentioned, this has happened recurrently throughout history. In the 60s, you mentioned the question about female education. There were negotiations.
Absolutely, yeah. No, yeah. So when it comes to, I think, we've had this conversation as well. King Faisal wanted to introduce education for girls in the 1960s, and the Salafi ulama, particularly, those who felt that this is really outrageous, it really changes the social fabric of Saudi society, and they opposed the king's decision. There were even riots in Riyadh. But that changed because the ulama had a conversation, negotiation, discussions with the ruling family, and agreed that women, we will promote, or we will allow women, to be educated, but perhaps we can control the curriculum. We can promote, yes, they can read and write, but there's certain things that they're allowed to read. There's certain things that they're allowed to, to be educated about. So I think, again, social reforms in particular, take place in these societies. In the context of Saudi Arabia, is a little bit different because of the relationship between the Salafi ulama and the ruling family. Egypt is very different. Kuwait is also very different. Haven't talked about Kuwait very much, but it's very different. But in the case of Saudi Arabia, for a long time, societal evolution takes place within the boundaries established by the state. Takes place within the boundaries established by the ulama. So the ulama did not talk about political issues, but when it came to social issues, the ruling family made sure that they had, conversations with the ulama. But again, we're going back to New Saudi Arabia. It's a little bit different.
Yeah, I was going to ask. So, I mean, is that equilibrium still there in the current? I don't know if it's too soon to talk about what's currently taking place, but there's been radical changes over a very short period of time, and I don't know if we've got the data or the information to be able to, like, how the current situation is being interpreted by the religious leadership of Saudi.
I think I'll be repeating myself as well. So I think there are two schools of thought when it comes to what's happening in Saudi Arabia. Some argue that we're looking at the Saudi religious establishment being completely defanged. They're no longer important, while others say, they're still important. I think for me, it's a little bit tricky because it's somewhere in between. The Saudi religious establishment continues to play an important role in certain areas. So they continue to deliver sermons, they continue to support the state, they continue to control certain areas within Saudi society, what's permitted by the state. So they still play an important role in Saudi Arabia when it comes to Hajj, when it comes to other matters, for example, religious matters in particular. They play an important role. But it's the state that has changed so much. the state allows the religious establishment to play the role that roles that they've played, but they are now preventing the religious establishment from discussing other matters that they, that they were allowed to discuss before. So social issues. Before, the Saudi ulama, played an important role. They were able to comment on religious education. They were able to comment on whether or not women should be allowed to participate in the Olympics, whether or not women should be allowed to work. But now these are the issues that the state controls, and the state doesn't want the ulama to talk about. So the state, I think I've said this in the lecture, they've created these spaces, and these spaces we're looking at, and as I've mentioned in the lecture, proliferation of spaces where the ulama have no control. So preach, talk about religion, issue fatwa if you have to, lead sermons if you have to. Of course, we will tell you what to say and what not to say. If you want to be cynical, but clearly, I think they have to be very careful. But if the state wants to organize concerts, the ulama are not allowed to discuss, are not allowed to criticize the state, are not allowed to comment unless they're supportive of the state. So again, I would say it's a little, somewhere in between. So they're still there, they're still important, they still play certain roles, but they're not allowed actually to comment on certain issues, particularly issues where the state feels, issues that the state feels important.
Thank you very much, Professor Raihan. I think that's all we have time for today.
Thank you.
But thank you for your time and for this conversation.
Thank you so much for having me.
If you enjoyed that, please like, share, and subscribe for more.